My earliest memories of my sister Clara are tangled with a sense of dread that crept into my daily life. She was 2 years older, taller, and had this uncanny ability to twist any situation to her advantage. Our parents, ever the peacemakers, often shrugged off her behavior, insisting that siblings simply squabbled. But what Clara did wasn't just typical sibling rivalry. She used my insecurities like weapons, flinging them at me whenever she felt the slightest irritation. I remember once, when I was 8, how she mocked the way I lisped my S's. I'd been so ashamed I tried to avoid speaking at school. The teachers called home, worried about my sudden silence. Clara pretended she had no idea what caused my change in behavior. And our parents, believing it was some fleeting childhood phase, let her get away with it. That was just the beginning. Over time, it grew worse. If I wanted to play with her, she'd sneer and call me clingy. If I dared to stand up for myself, she'd laugh in my face. Nothing I did was right, and I eventually learned to keep my head down. I stayed quiet to avoid provoking her cutting remarks. Yet, in spite of everything, I still looked up to her. She was popular, confident, and always seemed to get what she wanted. I used to believe that if I just tried hard enough to please her, she'd let me into her life on friendlier terms. I was wrong. In our teenage years, the bullying evolved into something more insidious. Clara was the queen of subtle jabs, slipping them into conversation like venomous snakes. At 15, I struggled with acne and felt painfully self-conscious. She'd remark, in front of her friends, that I should invest in a paper bag. Whenever I was around, I felt singled out as the family embarrassment. Sometimes I'd cry in my room, pressing my pillow to my face so no one could hear. Clara, on the other hand, thrived on attention. She joined clubs, sports teams, and pulled me along to social gatherings only to berate me in front of everyone. My self-esteem plummeted. The more she ridiculed me, the more I believed I deserved it. She never apologized, not once, for the cutting remarks that left permanent scars on my confidence. I could never figure out why she harbored such resentment toward me, but I had my theories. Sometimes, jealousy festers in unexpected corners. Other times, people just want someone to step on, a scapegoat for their own frustrations. She was bright, yes, and she had her share of admirers. Yet, behind closed doors, Clara seemed to nurse a kind of bitter satisfaction every time she tore me down. I was just the meek younger sister, desperate for her approval, yet unable to escape her wrath. By the time we both reached adulthood, I tried to distance myself from her. After high school, I moved to a different city for college, hoping the physical miles would offer me some emotional respite. For a while, I breathed easily, no longer worried about being cornered in my own home. I found new friends who seemed genuinely interested in my well-being, and I even mustered the courage to date a guy who found my quiet nature endearing. But Clara never vanished from my life entirely. She'd pop up at family gatherings, bringing her usual sarcasm and cruelty, disguising both behind a veneer of sisterly concern. She'd ask me about my grades, then smirk at my answers. She'd inquire about my social life, only to remark that she hoped I wasn't boring anyone to death with my monotone voice. Every meeting was a carefully orchestrated ambush. I thought that, with age, Clara might soften. People mature, gain empathy, or at least learn to fake it better. But she remained the same, perhaps even more refined in her tactics. It reached a point where I no longer mentioned her name to my close friends. I wanted to erase her from my narrative, to avoid the inevitable anxiety that accompanied the thought of her. Yet, deep down, I yearned for an explanation. What had I ever done to her that warranted such disdain? I never got a clear answer. 3 months after I graduated college, I received an email from Clara. The subject line read, "Dinner party, formal invitation." I almost deleted it without reading, convinced it was another attempt to get under my skin. But curiosity won out, and I opened the message. She'd typed a series of polished sentences, describing how she was hosting a celebratory dinner at her new home. Our parents would be there, plus some of her friends, colleagues, and prominent members of the community. She made it sound like an exclusive event that I'd be privileged to attend. Part of me wondered if this was just a ruse, but I'd felt a pang of naive hope. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch. Maybe, for once, she wanted to include me as part of her grown-up circle. Against my better judgment, I replied that I would come. I told my roommate, Maria, about the invitation. She raised an eyebrow and asked if I really wanted to subject myself to Clara's potential mind games, but I insisted I'd never know her intentions if I declined. And so, I bought a modest but elegant dress, something that made me feel confident without trying too hard. In the back of my mind, I was preparing for the worst. Still, I couldn't banish the tiny seed of optimism that maybe this time things would be different. I arrived at Clara's house an hour later than the time stated on the invitation, hoping to avoid being the first one there. The place was surprisingly grand, a testament to her success. She'd always been ambitious, chasing every opportunity with single-minded determination. I rang the doorbell, nerves twisting in my stomach. A butler answered, yes, an actual butler, and showed me into an expansive living room. The clink of silverware and the hum of conversation spilled from an adjoining dining room. I glimpsed at my watch, realizing it was barely 7:30. The invitation said dinner would start at 7, so I figured I wasn't that late. But as I stepped into the dining room, my stomach sank. The long table was littered with crumpled napkins, half-finished plates, and empty wine glasses. Everyone else had already eaten. Clara, seated at the head of the table, looked up and gave me a mocking smile. "Oh, you finally showed up," she drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter rippled through the guests. My cheeks flamed with embarrassment. I tried to stammer out an apology for being late, though in my mind, I was certain she had orchestrated this humiliation. She stood, walked around the table, and inspected me like I was some amateur performer who'd arrived after the show ended. Before I could gather my wits, Clara addressed me in a voice that oozed condescension. "Well, since you've missed dinner, you might as well be useful. We could use some help in the kitchen, clearing up the mess." She gestured to the array of dirty dishes and leftover food. I felt my pulse roar in my ears. There was a brief hush in the room, broken by a few snickers. Then he's delivered the line that cut me to the core. "After all, you're just a pathetic waitress, aren't you?" I didn't know what to say. My parents, sitting near the other end of the table, looked away, pretending not to have heard the insult. I stood there, feeling trapped, wishing I could vanish into the floor. I managed a shaky breath. Everything I'd suspected about this night turned out true. It was another chance for Clara to parade her cruelty. Part of me wanted to run, but I also felt an unfamiliar defiance flicker inside. How many times had I let her humiliate me, left the room in tears, and done nothing? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay, if only to see this charade through. Without a word, I gathered some of the plates and walked toward the kitchen, shame burning my face like a brand. In the kitchen, I dumped the plates onto the counter, trying to steady my trembling hands. I stared at the sink, piled high with dirty dishes, feeling a mixture of fury and heartbreak. The old me would have done exactly what Clara wanted, scrubbed away in silence, too afraid to stand up for myself. But I wasn't that same timid teenager anymore. I'd gone through college, made real friends, discovered my own sense of worth. Clara had no right to reduce me to the powerless little sister I used to be. I could almost hear Maria's voice in my head, telling me I deserved better. I locked the door behind me, shutting out the muffled chatter from the dining room, and stared at my reflection in the stainless steel fridge. I'd dolled myself up for this evening, hoping to forge some kind of reconciliation, but all I got was a fresh helping of public humiliation. The question was, what next? Would I leave and let her win again? Or would I finally find the strength to retaliate? As my anger rose, an idea began to form, born out of a quiet but relentless longing for justice. I remembered the times I'd fantasized about telling Clara off, about exposing her cruelty to the world. Yet, in reality, she was always a step ahead, carefully curating her public image as the gracious, successful sister. Everyone at that dinner believed her to be charming and witty, quick with a joke, warm with her hospitality. They didn't see the dagger she kept behind her back. If I confronted her now in a room full of people who admired her, they'd likely dismiss me as oversensitive or ungrateful. Besides, Clara was adept at twisting any confrontation to her advantage, making me look petty and vindictive. But the more I thought about it, the clearer I became that I refused to be a victim once more. My heartbeat thudded against my chest, and I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me. I dried my sweaty palms on a towel, refusing to wash a single dish. Instead, I plotted my revenge, something that would catch her off guard, something that would show her I was no longer an easy target. Forgiveness was off the table. She had crossed a line no apology could ever mend. I took a moment to steady my posture, lift my chin, and force my shoulders back. Then, I swung the kitchen door open and returned to the dining room. The chatter died down as I entered, and I noticed my father pushing his fork around an empty plate, my mother sipping from a wine glass. They were as complicit as always, turning a blind eye to the tension. Clara was entertaining a group of her colleagues, regaling them with a story that had them laughing on cue. She saw me approach and arched an eyebrow, a challenge glowing in her eyes. I would not let her see my fear. "Well," she asked, voice dripping with faux sweetness, "have you finally done something useful?" Her circle of admirers tittered, though a few wore uncertain expressions. I stepped closer, adopting an even tone. "Actually, I noticed we're out of wine glasses. I'm going to grab some from the cellar." Clara stared at me for a moment, clearly perplexed by my calm response. Before she could reply, I turned on my heel and walked away, taking the set of house keys I'd quietly lifted from the kitchen counter. Clara's house was sprawling, but I had a decent sense of its layout from earlier family visits. I knew there was a wine cellar in the basement and that it was one of her prized features. Downstairs, the air was cooler, carrying a faint smell of aged oak and fermented grapes. Rows of expensive bottles lined the walls. Clara had boasted about this collection for years, how it symbolized her refined taste and her status. My pulse still hammered, but I felt purposeful. As I reached the cellar, I stood in the dim light, scanning the racks of curated wines. Most were imported vintages, meticulously cataloged. My gaze settled on a specific row of rare bottles, some collector's edition with elaborate labels. I recalled her bragging about them once, claiming they were worth a small fortune. I weighed my options. My revenge needed to inflict the same humiliation she'd inflicted on me, or at least disrupt her perfect facade. Breaking these bottles in a fit of rage crossed my mind, but that felt too simple, too impulsive. I wanted something more precise, something that would burn through her social standing like acid. I decided to bide my time. I took 2 of the less expensive bottles and headed back upstairs, leaving the cellar door unlocked. The last thing I wanted was to alert Clara by carrying out armfuls of wine. When I re-emerged into the hallway, I could hear laughter drifting from the dining room, along with the faint melody of classical music. I paused by a small alcove where a half-open door led to a study. Inside, a desk lamp illuminated a stack of papers. Curiosity piqued, I quietly stepped in. On the desk lay a set of documents with Clara's name on them, property agreements, stock portfolios, and some notes about an upcoming business deal. This was a side of my sister I rarely saw, her professional empire. She had a lot riding on her public image, on being the polished, impeccable hostess and businesswoman. An idea sparked in my mind. Perhaps there was a way to strike at her carefully curated persona without resorting to messy physical destruction. I inhaled deeply, excitement coursing through my veins as I realized the power in my hands. I recalled the hush-hush nature of certain business acquisitions. If Clara was finalizing a deal, any whiff of scandal or legal entanglement could tank her negotiations and tarnish her credibility. I needed concrete evidence, something that would lay bare her ruthless side to the people who believed her every smiling word. Then I spotted a file folder labeled Confidential Purchase Agreement. My heart pounded as I flicked it open and scanned the pages. It contained details about a property acquisition that seemed to hinge on local permits and community support. The document outlined potential environmental concerns, ones that the local council would not look kindly upon if they were fully aware. Apparently, Clara's plan involved bending or outright ignoring some regulations. If exposed, it would land her in hot water. My pulse quickened with the possibility. I could whistle-blow this entire project, turn the spotlight on her shady dealings, and watch her carefully balanced world collapse. For years, she'd made me feel worthless. This might be my chance to show her that she couldn't trample on me or anyone else without consequence. Standing there with the incriminating documents in my hands, I hesitated. This wasn't just petty payback, it was serious. I was contemplating upending her career, her reputation, her future. A faint voice inside warned me that revenge can be a poison that warps a person's soul. But I also remembered the sting of tears in my childhood bedroom, the mocking laughter in the hallway at school, the unwavering cruelty she hurled at me tonight. She had never shown remorse, never even hinted at regret. Why should I grant her any mercy? I carefully snapped pictures of each page with my phone, making sure the text was legible. Then I placed the folder back exactly as I found it. My heart pounded in my ears, but I felt a strange euphoria. I had evidence that could bring her down, or at least rattle her castle of privilege. I slipped out of the study, the wine bottle still in hand, and rejoined the party. Clara was still the center of attention, of course. I set the bottles on the table, poured a glass for myself, and took a sip while she glared at me for taking so long. I wore a polite smile, letting the wine's warmth soothe my nerves. Clara approached, her expression a mask of sweet malice. "Where have you been?" she asked, her tone implying I was still a nuisance. I shrugged. "Went to find something worthy of your guests," I replied, holding up the bottle. She studied me for a moment, perhaps sensing a change in my demeanor. She couldn't figure out why I was no longer cowering. Then, like the consummate performer she was, she plastered on a gracious smile and took the bottle from my hands. "Thank you for your help, dear sister," she said, voice oozing with artificial benevolence. "Perhaps you're not entirely useless." My parents chuckled nervously. I let the comment slide off me because, for once, I felt untouchable. She had no idea what ammunition I'd just gathered. A storm brewed inside my chest, but I kept my face serene. For the rest of the evening, I lingered at the periphery of conversations, answering politely when spoken to, mentally rehearsing my next steps. As the night wound down, guests began drifting away. Clara busied herself with goodbyes and pleasantries, her voice bright and cheerful. I watched from near the foyer, arms folded, noticing how expertly she manipulated everyone's perception. It was a performance so refined that even our parents seemed to forget the insults she hurled at me earlier. When the last guest left, she turned to me and offered a mocking little wave. "Don't forget to lock up," she said, as though I were just another household staff member. I didn't dignify that with a response. She swept up the stairs to her bedroom, leaving me with my thoughts in the darkened hallway. My parents had gone too, presumably to one of the spare rooms. I stood there in the hush of the house, feeling the weight of the phone in my pocket. If I followed through with my plan, I'd be stepping into a realm of retribution from which there was no turning back. But in my mind, the choice was clear. Clara had turned cruelty into an art form, and it was time she faced real consequences. I waited until I got back to my small apartment the next day before I took any drastic action. My night had been restless, my mind churning with everything that had transpired. Around noon, after I woke from a fitful sleep, I pulled out my phone and examined the photos again. It was all there. Details about bribing an official to overlook environmental regulations, about forging certain documents to expedite the property sale. Clara's signature adorned every page. I crafted an email to an investigative journalist I'd followed online. She specialized in exposing corporate and political corruption. I attached the images and wrote a succinct message, explaining that I believed this project was riddled with wrongdoing. I didn't sign my name. I used a newly created email account to maintain anonymity. Then, with a single click, I sent the evidence into the digital ether, my heart pounding with adrenaline and a dash of fear. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my breath short, my fingers trembling. This was it. I had lit a fuse, and soon Clara's entire enterprise might explode. I heard nothing for a week. No phone calls from strangers, no urgent emails from journalists. Life went on as though I hadn't just tried to sabotage my own sister's project. Meanwhile, Clara's social media presence remained its usual glossy self. Pictures of her attending lavish events, posting motivational quotes about success, smiling with perfect poise. I felt a twinge of doubt. Maybe the journalist had dismissed my tip as inconsequential, or perhaps she was gathering more evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning when everything changed. The local news site ran an exclusive exposé detailing corruption in a major development project. The article implicated powerful business figures, including a rising real estate mogul known for her philanthropic facade. Though they didn't mention Clara by name in the initial teaser, the follow-up article dropped all pretense. My sister's face was plastered across the front page, along with damning quotes from city officials who claimed they'd been coerced or bribed. Within hours, social media lit up with outrage. Investors started pulling out. A wave of scandal crashed over her pristine reputation. My phone rang incessantly that day. First, my parents, frantic. They wanted to know if I'd heard the news, if I understood the ramifications for the family. I feigned surprise, insisting I just saw the headlines like everyone else. Then came a call from Clara. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was ragged, stripped of its usual confidence. "Did you see what they're saying about me?" she demanded, practically hissing into the receiver. "They're lies. All lies." I listened as she ranted, claiming she had no idea why she was being targeted, that someone was out to destroy her. She wanted my sympathy, I realized. She believed I was still the meek little sister who would offer comfort, no matter how badly she treated me. I felt a spark of vindication, but I kept my tone cool. "I'm sorry you're going through that," I said, trying not to let my voice betray my satisfaction. "I hope you figure it out." Then, before she could respond, I hung up. Her sudden vulnerability didn't move me. She'd never spared a single kind word for me. I owed her nothing. Over the next few days, the scandal ballooned. Legal investigations began. Investors severed ties. My parents were distraught, worried about the family's reputation. Clara had retreated from the public eye, presumably on the advice of her legal team. I heard she was holed up in her house, refusing to see visitors. A small part of me felt guilt nibbling at the edges of my conscience. I had, after all, unleashed a storm that jeopardized her livelihood. But then I remembered her jeering voice at that dinner party, the years of torment, the tears I'd shed in silence. She wasn't innocent. She'd built her empire on deceit and cruelty. Word spread that she was scrambling to salvage the deal, but the authorities were already picking apart every contract she'd signed, every permit she'd obtained. The local government threatened a lawsuit. I heard rumors about potential criminal charges if they found enough evidence of fraudulent paperwork. Meanwhile, the journalist continued to publish follow-up articles. The public, always eager for a scandal, devoured every fresh revelation. Clara's name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Then, one cold evening, she appeared at my door. I opened it to find her standing in the hallway, eyes ringed with exhaustion, mascara smudged. She looked as though she'd aged 10 years in a matter of days. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "I need your help," she said, voice small. "They're tearing me apart in the media. You have to tell them it's not true. You have to fix this." She clutched my arm, desperation turning her grip into a vice. I studied her face, this woman who'd tormented me since childhood, who had never offered me a single shred of kindness without an ulterior motive. Now she wanted me to save her. I stood firm, peeling her fingers off me. I realized then that I felt no sympathy, only a calm detachment. The old me would have cowered, tried to console her, but that person was gone. "I'm not going to fix anything," I said quietly. "I'm done protecting you, done being your punching bag. If you made your bed from lies, you can lie in it alone." A flicker of disbelief passed over her features. She searched my eyes for the timid sister she'd always known, but found only resolve. Without another word, I closed the door. As her footsteps faded, I felt a surge of liberation. Revenge was not always a dish best served cold. Sometimes it burned, scalding away the memories of pain until there was nothing left but relief. I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, unburdened at last. I'd refused her final plea, and in doing so, I reclaimed the self-respect I'd spent a lifetime being denied. With that, the chapter on Clara closed, and I felt free.